You were gonna ask me what prompted me to want to make this in the first place, something like that.
I was, but I think everybody, I don't think I have to give you the question now.
I had no intention of making this film. I was in a little town called Lucca in 2016. Have any of you heard of Lucca? It's, I see you're great opera lovers. Lucca is the birthplace and home of Puccini. And I was there to get the Puccini Prize for my work in opera. I directed a lot of operas. I'm not quite sure how many, but I directed 3 or 4 of Puccini's operas, and I was getting this Puccini Prize in Lucca. And I was there for 8 days. And I thought, well, you know, it's a lovely little town, horses and carriages everywhere, very old city, wonderful food, everything. But I had to be there for 8 days doing master classes and Q&As and stuff. And I thought, 8 days is too long. But someone mentioned that Pisa was a 35-minute drive from Lucca, and I wanted to see the Leaning Tower. Do you know about the Leaning Tower? What is it? It's a tower that leans. That's right. Okay, the schools are good around here. Great reputation. And someone else at this little gathering when I first got there said that in Pisa there is an airport with a 1-hour flight to Rome, which there was no airport in Lucca to Rome, no flight to Rome. So I have a number of friends in Rome, and I wrote to a friend of mine who's a theologian in Rome. His name is Andrea Manda, and he writes about Catholic issues. May I? Thank you. They're pretty good here. He writes about Catholic issues. And I sent him an email saying, can I have some of your pop? No, I didn't say that. You think it would be possible for me, if I took a day out of my trip here in Lucca and came to Rome, do you think it would be possible to meet with Father Amorth? And he wrote me back the next day. He emailed me and said, Father Amorth would be very happy to meet with you. Now, Father Amorth, as I mentioned in this, had written about my film, The Exorcist, in his first book. An Exorcist Tells His Story. And he wrote, this was in its 60th or 70th printing now, all over the world. And he wrote in his book that while the special effects were over the top in The Exorcist, the film did help people to understand his work. So he was very happy to meet with me. I met with him. I had a great meeting, and that was it. I went back to Lucca, finished up there, and then went back to Los Angeles, where I live. And my wife and I went to the Vanity Fair Academy Award party that year. Have you heard of that? You heard of it, right? They're not going to be doing it too much longer. The editor left, Graydon Carter. And he was there, and he said to me, well, are you doing any operas? And I said no, but I did meet with the Vatican exorcist. And he said, oh, geez, you got to write that for Vanity Fair. And I said, well, I didn't even tape record him. I just met with him. He said, no, go back. And go back to Rome and interview him for Vanity Fair. He said, I'll give you I'll give you the whole magazine. Well, I wrote a 6,500 word article about Father Amorth, and at the time that I did go back to interview him, I asked him if he would ever allow me to witness an exorcism. And no one gets to witness an exorcism. I don't think there's 1/10 of 1% of people high up in the Catholic Church that have ever seen or been involved with an exorcism. And that includes bishops, priests, cardinals, and popes. Although John Paul II was an exorcist in Poland, and he left 3 cases to Father Amorth, one of whom he liberated, the other 2 he was still treating at the time of his death. And the church gives no information about these. They don't talk about it, which is rightly so, because it's a very personal and private matter. And they also don't want people to know that a lot of times, like what you've just seen, it's not successful. People can undergo this procedure for years and still have these fits. And unlike the film that I made, that I guess some of you are going to see, it's not a permanent condition. Like the little girl in The Exorcist, once she appears to be possessed, that's it. She stays that way until there's an exorcism. That isn't the way it happens. They come and go like fits, like epileptic fits, if you've ever seen or known someone who had something like that. And the church doesn't really want people to know that there are people out there who claim to have been possessed, were exorcised, and not liberated. I mean, that's not a great step forward. So very little is known about it. But I asked Father Amorth, when I did go back to interview him for the magazine, if he would ever allow me to witness an exorcism, thinking the answer would be no. To my amazement, he said, let me think about it. And a couple of days later, I got word back from the head of his order, the Pauline priests in Rome, saying that he would allow me to witness an exorcism on May 1st of 2016, as I mentioned in the film. And I then pushed my luck and asked him a couple of days later if he would let me film it. Again, thinking the answer would be absolutely not, because it has never been filmed. And he sent word back saying, all right, you can film it, but you have to come alone. No crew, no lights. And so I brought this little camera, and I filmed this documentary basically with a still camera that shoots high definition video, my cell phone, and a GoPro. Do you know what a GoPro is? You guys use a GoPro? That's a... Why is that funny? GoPro's a pretty damn good camera. It's mostly what they attach to these drone shots that you see. But anyway, after I finished the film, I had no idea about releasing it or doing anything with it. I filmed it because I could, and I wanted to have it. And then it occurred to me that I should take it to 2 or 3 of the best brain surgeons in the country and 2 or 3 of the leading psychiatrists in this country and let them debunk it. I actually took it to them so that they would explain what it was in medical or psychiatric terminology or in some kind of layperson's language. And you see what they came up with. The brain surgeons, while they say everything originates in the brain, this was not a problem of this woman's brain. And the psychiatrists now recognize it. They call it dissociative identity disorder, demonic possession, which means if someone comes to them and says, I think I'm possessed, they don't say, no, you're not. We'll give you a little therapy and some medication and you'll be fine. They bring in an exorcist now. And the 2 of the guys who, the psychiatrists I interviewed, that were the editors of the DSM-4 and the DSM-5, which is the psychiatric manual of the diseases that they treat. There are over 400. They sometimes take stuff out. Like they used to treat homosexuality. You could go to a psychiatrist and say, I'm homosexual and you could go in for therapy. Well, they don't do that anymore. And they don't treat narcissism anymore. I guess they feel everybody from the top of the country down is a narcissist. So they got nothing for that anymore, but they got stuff for exorcism. It's a strange profession. One of the psychiatrists, who's one of the leading psychiatrists in the world, when I showed him my film, I didn't include this in the documentary, but when I showed him my film, he said to me, well, it looks authentic. It looks like this is an authentic case, but she doesn't have the classic symptoms. And I said, well, doctor, what are the classic symptoms? He said, well, her head doesn't spin and she doesn't levitate. I said, doctor, we made that up. I don't know that that ever happened anywhere. You can get no information at all that's of any value about possession and exorcism. All of the movies that have been made are, for the most part, just trash. And the sequels. Trash 2, Trash 3, Trash 4 and 5, which I think came out the same year. And they give you nothing, and the church will tell you nothing. And so nothing really is known. And I don't know, as I think of it, we don't know anything about the eternal truths. Not the greatest philosophers and scholars who ever lived know anything more than any one of us. It's what you believe, but we don't know. We don't know if there's an afterlife. No one ever knew if there's a heaven or a hell or the devil or whatever. We have our belief system, but nobody ever in the history of the world has ever known. Unless you believe in some of the great mystics and philosophers, or if you believe in the teachings of Jesus, as I do. I believe very strongly in the teachings of Jesus, though I'm not a Catholic. And I have to remember whenever I say that the people who wrote about Jesus wrote nothing himself, left nothing in his own handwriting. No one alive has ever heard the sound of his voice or seen his picture. And yet billions of people have believed in the teachings of Jesus, as I do, but I have to remember that the New Testament was written by people who were starting a religion. They were not writing history. They were starting a religion. And as other religions have been started by other people. And so it goes into the supernatural. But my own belief system does not depend on the supernatural. And I just happen to have this belief system, which I guess is what kept me interested in the subject all these years. But I never intended to do anything more about it. And now, I say again, I will never revisit this subject. There's no more to be said. But there are experiments going on that are very interesting. The Israeli doctor in the film is the leader of a study that's being done throughout the world by brain surgeons and researchers into the origins of evil. And they have located something in the brain that is defined as the kill switch. That part of the brain that provokes aggression. And they showed me a film that was made in 1950 in Madrid, where a Spanish researcher took one of the fighting bulls, and it was considered a very brave bull. And they took this bull, and he, based on his own theories, went into the place in the brain in 1950, in the brain of the bull, where he felt aggression originated. They've now mapped the brain to a far greater extent than they ever did back then, close to 70 years ago. And the guy who's in this film, Dr. Mazziota, is the head of the brain mapping project in this country. But in 1950, a Spanish brain researcher went into the brain of a bull and removed something in this area. And then the bull recovered, and they sent the bull back into the ring, and it would not charge the cape. They provoked it with the red cape, they provoked it with whatever they had, and the bull would not charge. And that was the beginning of the research into the kill switch. Now they have discovered exactly where this exists in the human brain, but they can't do anything about it because you get into medical ethics and the Clockwork Orange syndrome. Are you going to take something out of this guy's brain because you think that's what causes him to be evil? It doesn't fall under medical ethics. So it's out there, and if they were using it, they might have gotten to some people who have committed mass murder. And it's a really good question that I'd like to put to you. Would you do that? How many people, if you knew that you could remove something from the brain of a mad person, a Hitler or a Manson or one of these guys that shoots up a school or the Austin bomber, if you could have the opportunity to take something out of this person's brain, how many would do it? Right? One hand? A couple? Two. I find that really interesting. You're all medical ethicists. It's a very tough call, but obviously not for you guys. I don't know, it's a really good question. There is good and evil in all of us, in every single person, and there always has been. And I think it's a constant struggle for each of us to let our better angels survive and thrive. Does anyone have any questions? Have you have any? Yes, ma'am.
That center,
Here.
the center that you were talking about, the removing, is it aggression or is it a morality decision-making base? Which is why I didn't raise my hand, because I think there's a difference there.
It was the place where aggression exists in the brain. Everything originates in the brain. Everything. Every emotion, everything. And aggression exists in the brain, as does goodwill. And they have mapped the brain to such an extent that they now know where aggression is. And it started with these experiments in 1950 in Spain. But now that I've clarified it, what would your answer be? Would you remove it if you knew it would stop a guy from going into a hotel and shooting a bunch of people on the street?
I don't know, because I'm not sure. I mean, I don't know if that's pure aggression, if there's more to it than just a physical act of aggression versus the choice to do harm. Because an aggressive act could simply also come from a place of, like, a number of reasons.
Road rage or
something like that, versus I plotted, something that would be considered more along the lines of evil, that we would call evil.
Well, the question that drove me with this documentary and with my film, The Exorcist, was what happens when someone exhibits behavior like this? Is it sickness? Or is it evil? Or is it both? Is this woman being pursued for God knows what reason? By an evil spirit? That's pretty hard to digest. Or is it a kind of sickness that in a way can be cured? Now what The Exorcist is doing is attempting to cure this. But what they believe is not that they are performing the exorcism. They're calling on Jesus to do it, and the saints. And they don't believe that it's the priest who does it. He calls on Jesus, and Jesus will or won't do it in his own time. So Father Amorth was exorcising one man for 16 years without success. And this was Christina's 9th exorcism without success. Any other questions? Yes?
So when you were in the room with Christina and from beginning to end of this experience, what is your thought process? What's going through
What is what?
Your thought process. What are you what thoughts are going through your head as you're experiencing
I was
this?
terrified. That's what was going through my head. I watched a woman who otherwise seemed totally normal. She was an architect. Really soft-spoken, intelligent. When she walked into the room, I wondered, what in the hell is this woman doing here? There's nothing wrong with her. And then in the course of the ritual, you see what happened. And it was terrifying to watch this complete transformation of personality. It was like if I'm sitting here and talking to you, and suddenly I start to freak out in unusual ways, and my voice changes, and I get uncommon strength and anger and an almost total physical transformation, an out-of-body experience, and I was 2 feet away from them. The only thing I cut, the only thing I didn't show, was that Father Amorth had told me that in the course of this exorcism, Christina, through the demon, accused him of his sins, and they were accurate. I didn't ask him what they were. I did not ask him what his sins were, and I decided to leave that alone. But the demon cited his sins to him. Otherwise, I really didn't cut anything. There are a couple of frame cuts when I lost focus on the camera because of all the movement. But they're frame cuts. But that's what I saw. It was absolutely terrifying to watch somebody go through a personality transformation like that, but also to see this priest using the skills that he had to try and help her. I found that very moving. And my emotions, as I recall them, went from fear and terror into empathy for her, because she told me later she was in great pain. She was in great pain throughout this ritual. Anything else? Yes.
Yes. Would having seen an exorcism been performed, would that have changed how you filmed The Exorcist?
That's an interesting question. I've gotten it before. The question was, having seen what purports to be an actual exorcism, would I have changed the way I made the Exorcist movie? I couldn't have done that, because the Exorcist film is fiction. You know, it was preceded by a novel that a lot of people had read. And the novel had all of these incidents in them that Mr. Blatty, basically, Bill Blatty invented the concept of possession and exorcism as we all know and understand it. It's just that simple. There's almost no authoritative work on the subject. What people think of as demonic possession and exorcism was created for his novel by William Peter Blatty. And he had nothing to go on. He went to the Library of Congress and researched there for the better part of a year and found nothing of value. In the United States, in the 20th century, there are 2 reported cases of possession and exorcism. One was the 1949 case, the reports of which inspired Bill Blatty, and I stand in front of the house in this film where that happened, in Cottage City, Maryland. And the other case was in 1922 in a little town called Erling, Iowa, Earling. It was a woman, a young woman. In 1949, it was a 14-year-old boy. But Bill Blatty was inspired by reports of that case. He never knew anything about it. The church never spoke about it. He did have correspondence with the exorcist of Father William Bowdern in the 49 case. And the only thing, I've seen the correspondence, the only thing that Father Bowdern said to him that really inspired Blatty was he said, of this I can tell you I'm certain, this was the real thing. This case was the real thing. And Blatty, 15 years later, decided to write it as fiction because he couldn't get any of the facts. So, the novel and the movie The Exorcist are made up. It's not the people from the 49 case. It's not where it happened, it's not what happened, it's the characters are different. He made it up based on people he knew, in a world that he knew. Mm-hmm.
There's an anti-religious movement that's been going on in the U.S. for the last 15 years with Dawkins and Hitchens and these guys, demonstrating that there's commandments to violence in the Abrahamic traditions, and it's a bad idea to have religion because it promotes and supports violence, and this is a bad thing. On the other hand, you suggested in the film that this idea of an occult reality behind this one is an inspiring and maybe an enriching idea. So I'm wondering if you could, would you erase religion and have a planet of rational, kind of rational, principled people looking at reality as a basis for decisions? Or do you think that this blanking and hidden occult reality behind this one is enriching?
Thank you. Emotion trumps reason every time. Emotion trumps reason. I.e., it's why you have religion. People's belief, their belief system is so strong, you cannot banish religion or people's belief. It seems to me that for the most part, there are believers and non-believers. And there are believers in different religions. There is a kind of possession that goes on in other religions. It's not the same as what happens in the Catholic Church. But look, I read Dawkins, and I've read Christopher Hitchens. Hitchens especially is a brilliant writer, and has. Do you know there is a thing in the Catholic Church when somebody is being promoted for sainthood, like Mother Teresa was promoted for sainthood and became a saint in the Catholic Church not long ago. And there's always a person in that mix who's known literally as the devil's advocate. The devil's advocate is the person that's chosen to speak out against the sainthood of this person. And in the case of Mother Teresa, the person who spoke against her and denounced her and said she was not fit to be a saint was Christopher Hitchens, whose opinions are strongly held and brilliantly written. But he doesn't know any more than I do or that you do. People's belief system is a hard thing to cultivate and a hard thing to break down. Who is anybody to say there is no God? We don't know. There's something. You know, what was the Big Bang Theory? Who caused that? What caused that? We don't know. There's so many myths in the Bible that, and so much supernatural, that you're taken out away from people's genuine belief system. I have heard, how many here are Catholic, if you don't mind saying? Not too many. I have had people who are practicing, you sir? Yes. I've had practicing Catholics say to me that without the virgin birth and without the resurrection, there is no religion. I don't believe that. I don't require the reality of the virgin birth and the resurrection. I don't say they didn't exist. I don't know. There's so many strange things about this world that we neither know nor understand and never will. But I don't need the supernatural to believe in the great teachings of Jesus. You all know that there was a historical figure named Jesus. He is not a creation of mythology. There are the first century historians, principally a Jewish historian named Flavius Josephus. And there was a man called Philo and Eusebius who wrote histories of first century Jerusalem. Not religious texts. The history of what went on in first century Jerusalem. Read Josephus, which is a very interesting account. It's still in print. It's always in paperback. And in Josephus' history of first century Jerusalem, he mentions this man called Jesus Christ, who went among the people and was beloved of the people, and he healed the sick. And basically, that's all he said. That's it. Was he a doctor? Was he some kind of a great doctor? Josephus did not go into the supernatural aspects of Jesus, but there was such a person there's, I think, a 12-year period in his life where nothing is known about where he was or what he was doing. And he died at the age of 33. And that's what's amazing to me. And that's what turns my head away from the rational and toward the emotional. For 2,000 years, billions of people have believed in this man who died at the age of 33, an obscure death by crucifixion. The Romans crucified thousands and thousands of people. And he was one of them. And now, 2,000 years later, there's billions of people who believed in him and believed that he was the Son of God and, belonged to the church. I find that amazing. The power of belief. And neither Hitchens, nor Dawkins, nor anybody else can erase that. Because emotion trumps logic. Every time. Any other questions? Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
I'm curious, you had mentioned that the church is kind of keeping a low profile on repeat cases. Okay. You had mentioned that the church is keeping kind of a low profile, or does it mention repeat cases?
All cases.
Okay.
They won't talk about any of them to anybody.
I'm curious if you got a sense that the church feels like, particularly with repeat cases or maybe just with possession in general, do they perceive it as a weakness of the person? Do they perceive it as a person just being in the wrong place at the wrong time? Or in particular with repeat cases, is it because the demon is so strong that the church can't evict them?
Most priests that I've talked to, and this archbishop and many others, they either don't believe it anymore, they don't buy into it, or they're afraid of it. As the Archbishop of Los Angeles said. He said in the film, which is the most shocking thing anyone said to me in this film, I am not at a spiritual level enough to do battle with the devil. And you heard what I said to him, but you're a bishop, it doesn't get much higher than that. He said, I know, but I said, you have the power of Christ. He said, indeed I do. And he said, but I'm not at the spiritual level of someone like Father Amorth. He was in a class by himself. The church won't talk about any of it, nor should they. Father Amorth was a great critic of the Vatican. Even though he was the Vatican exorcist, he was an extreme critic of the church and the Vatican. And they never tried to contradict him. He was so beloved. You could see the turnout at his funeral and the thousands of people in the streets. It is not likely in our time that he will be promoted for sainthood, but he would have. But he accused the church of he said literally in newspapers and on television all over Italy that the devil is in the Vatican, that there is corruption throughout the church and in the Vatican. And there was a famous murder case of a teenage girl, I think around 2015, who worked in and her father had a job in Vatican City. And she was missing. She went missing and was then found murdered. And Father Amorth accused people in the Vatican of having murdered her. And he told the story of the little girl's, of the teenage young woman's parents who went to see the Pope. And they asked about their daughter before they knew that she was dead. She was missing. And they had an audience with the Pope, and Father Amorth mentioned this. They went to see the Pope to talk about their daughter, and the Pope said, oh, she is in heaven. And this was before she was found to be murdered. So he put all that stuff out there, and there was never any blowback against him. Not publicly. So he just wasn't some knee-jerk guy with a strange belief system. He was a serious critic of the Vatican while being the Vatican exorcist. Any other questions? You had one, yes.
I think it's interesting that Christina is able to have a steady boyfriend. And I wondered when he threatened you, if you thought he was speaking out of possession himself, or what did you make of him?
No, it was a complete change of personality on his part. But I found out, not long after, he's the member of a very dangerous cult, a world cult that's known as the Pyramid Cult. You can read about them in Wikipedia. They're very dangerous people, and he's a member of that. And he completely, when I met him, and I have this on film, I didn't use it, but I filmed myself while I'm meeting these guys, and he shook hands with me, her parents, and Father Amorth introduced us, and he couldn't have been more polite, even obsequious. And he wanted my autograph, and then it completely changed in the church in Alatri. And he said, we want this film, you must bring it back, it shows the work of the devil. And she was saying in the demon voice, no, I want this shown, in that deep guttural voice. And I said to him, I'm not going to give it back to you. Just forget that. You're not going to get this back. And we left, my translator and I. But he said, before we left, he said, if you don't give us back the film, I will find you and kill your family.
Did you hear from him again?
No.
Good.
Would you like me to?
No.
You have anything you'd like to say to him? Yes.
I'm interested in your opinion about being that you've been a filmmaker for many decades. What's your opinion? This is not so much a question about exorcism, but about filmmaking nowadays. What do you think is the state of filmmaking now, as opposed to what it was during the 60s, the 70s, or the 80s, or the 90s? Where do you think we are now?
Well, we're in 2018 now. But I hardly see any of the films. They're not for me. I mean, the greatest films I've ever seen were from the 40s, and then some into the 50s, and then the 60s was a very important period. I'm talking about cinema, not some movie. Movies are great, and then there's cinema, which is different. And there's not too much cinema being made. Mostly, you know what it is. It's spandex movies. Guys flying, and now a woman flying around the world in a spandex costume, saving the world. And they never get hurt, and there's never any real danger or real suspense. And on the few occasions when I've seen some of these films in a theater, people just stare at them like this. It's like opium for the eyes to me. There's very little that interests me that's being made today. And even the independent films, which are pretty damn good. And there's a horror film you may have seen, A Quiet Place. Have you seen that? I like that. I thought that was very well made. And Get Out, I thought was a really brilliantly made film. I can't think of, I like Three Billboards, I loved I, Tonya, which I guess this company made.
Legally, I can't say that, but our sister company.
Legally, you're gonna get arrested? Or?
Well, no, it's the vertical integration of Hollywood. We can't be a distributor and an exhibition house.
See, they just busted themselves.
You got me good.
Busted! No, I answer your question. Is that I don't watch a lot of the films today. We have a screening room at home. Screen a little less than this. And we usually have a buffet dinner at our house, maybe a couple of days a week. We get the new films. I never go up and see them. I just have the buffet and go to bed. About 16 other people go watch Batman or somebody beat the shit out of some poor villain. I always feel for the bad guy because he always loses. No, is that an answer? You have my answer? Okay, yes, great thing.
I wanted to mention to you that in around '98, when you came out with the special edition of The Exorcist,
That was 2000.
2000, yes, sir. I had at the time, a roommate, and he was very much agnostic, but really said he was an atheist. And I determined that The Exorcist was the perfect test for whether someone really was an atheist or not. So I played that movie in the house, and that roommate, he decided to go and hide and turn up his stereo so loud that he couldn't hear it. And so there
Is he still hiding?
He is actually still hiding.
Oh, wow.
There was really something in that film that you restored, or you talked about the restoration in a special edition, which was the moment where the two priests are on the staircase, and you thought it was too Catholic. But that actually helped get me back to faith, that very moment. Something spoke to me there about how the demon was basically making the girl so ugly, there's no way God could love us.
Yes.
And that was a very, very profound thing to me. And I was wondering, do you have that in tonight's version? Or
Yes.
It is fantastic.
Yes. I put back the 12 minutes that I took out when I released the film 27 years before that screening. It didn't have 12 minutes. It didn't have the scene on the stairs. And for 27 years, Bill Blatty used to call me. We'd see each other all the time or talk on the phone. He begged me to put that stuff back because he felt, as you said, that was the religious backbone of the film. It was the spiritual backbone. And I was too dumb to realize it. But I put it back in for two reasons. One, Bill Blatty gave me his novel to make into a film. And it's a great story. It's it's the greatest story I've ever had in my hands. And two, frankly, Warner Brothers said if I put that 12 minutes back, they will re-release the film theatrically, which they did. It went out and made another $100 million.
That's awesome.
Okay, we have time for one more question.
Oh, no, there's a couple more. It's only 9 o'clock.
Well, we gotta turn the house for The Exorcist.
What are you going to turn it into?
We didn't. This wasn't Shaker came up with. Okay.
Wait a minute. Wait, just a minute. You mean this isn't the audience for The Exorcist?
Some of them might be.
Well, what about the others who aren't? Because you wanted me to introduce that.
Oh yeah.
But to another group?
It'll be some of the same people, and some are going to be different.
Oh, well, I know. It's all dark out there. No, let's get a couple of questions in.
Okay, let's go to the back row. You man.
Hi.
Hello.
Yeah.
Thanks so much for this film, by the way, because I really appreciate it. I have so many questions, so I'm going to try to narrow this down. I really want to know what it was like back when you filmed The Exorcist on set. Did you experience anything that was supernatural or even tested your way of, I mean, where were you spiritually and how did filming that change you? Was there anything that happened on set that you could share with us?
There were a lot of things that happened that were unusual and extraordinary. The most extraordinary of which was one morning at 4 a.m. I got a phone call from my production manager, and he said, "Don't bother to come to work today." And I said, "Why? Am I fired?" And he said, "No." He said, "A couple of hours ago, around 2 in the morning, the entire set burned to the ground."
Wow.
Now, the exterior of the house is a house in Georgetown to this day. And I believe I show it in this film. The interior of the house was built on a soundstage, 2 floors. All the rooms were a set in New York on the west side of Manhattan. And the little girl's bedroom was a separate set. And the entire house burned to the ground, and nobody knew why. There was a watchman sitting outside the door. He saw the smoke coming from under the door. He opened the door, and the entire set was in flames. And the insurance company paid off on the theory that because it was an old building, there were, in fact, pigeons flying around all over the place. And they went with the theory that a pigeon flew into a light box and caused this fire. We never found the real reason, but they did pay Warner Brothers based on that theory. There were other things that happened. I won't say they were quite so supernatural, but the set burning down of its own volition was pretty bad. But you asked what my attitude was, what my spiritual feelings were. I made the film as a believer. I am not a skeptic to this day. I made the film as though I believed every single frame of it. And because you're still watching it 45 years later, I think that's one of the reasons why. I did not make the film as a doubter, as a doubting Thomas. I made the film believing in the veracity of the story, which I have to do with every film I make. When I made The French Connection, I knew that these cops showed racist behavior, but that's who they were. And I was interested in them and what they did in the street. And that's what they did. So when there's a line in the film of The French Connection, where how many of you have seen The French Connection? There's a line in the film where the Gene Hackman character says to his partner, Roy Scheider, who's been stabbed by an African-American man in the street, he says to him, never trust a nigger. And when that line played in an African-American theater, there was usually applause and laughter and roars, because that's the way it was. That was the behavior of these cops, and I didn't sugarcoat it or try to make them seem like saints. I made the film about them and who they were. I didn't impose my own beliefs on them. And with The Exorcist, I made the film as though I was a believer. Every second, every moment, in every aspect of the story. And that I've only made, I think, 15 films, RJ, in 53 years.
That's correct.
I made about 15. It's nice to be right about my own. He validates me at all times. I haven't made any other films because I don't believe it. If I don't believe the story, I don't want anything to do with it. So you take a film like Killer Joe and Bug, which are quite in a different world from this other stuff. Well, I was on the same page, the same worldview as the author of those pieces. That is how I saw the world at that time. And I have not made a film since because I haven't seen anything that has pulled me as much. Does that answer your question? Or not?
It does.
All right. Now what do you want to do?
We'll do one more.
Okay.
And then, how many people are here staying for The Exorcist?
You mean I
See-
can stand here while you change the house?
No, we were going to hang out.
I stopped hanging out when I was 27.
You can sit here, we can go.
One more, he says.
Yeah.
Who has the creme de resistance? Who is going to give me the question that will turn this whole thing around? That will spin this thing on a dime and turn it into a transcendent experience. That's the question I want. If you don't have that question, don't answer. Yes, go ahead.
What is William Peter Blatty? What do you imagine his reaction would be to this film?
I think he would love it. Honestly. Which is why I dedicated it to him. Blatty and I, we had, over the years, a lot of discussions about Father Amorth. All of these articles would appear. He's done 20,000 exorcisms, 50,000. All of these radical, outrageous claims that Blatty and I knew were impossible. These claims were made by other people, not by him. But he was, when I met him, he was doing about 3 exorcisms a day. And he was 91. Blatty for the most part, until toward the end of his life, thought he was a charlatan. And I found a lot of it hard to accept. Man has done 50,000 exorcisms. Well, then when you figure 31 years as the Vatican exorcist, and 6 more years that he had apprenticed under the man who was the Vatican exorcist, the numbers add up. But every morning he would get up and have his little breakfast, and he would answer all of his mail. He couldn't do all of it. He was getting thousands of letters, and he would write his answers in longhand on a piece of paper, and he would write the address on the envelope and put the stamp on the envelope and answer everybody who wrote to him eventually. And they could not all, you heard the figure that's given in this film, over 500,000 people a year in Italy, a country of a little over 62 million people. Over 500,000 seek an exorcism. They don't all receive it. With Father Amorth, you had to see one of several doctors, brain surgeons that he dealt with in Italy, or psychiatrists that he dealt with. And if they said they couldn't help the person, they would be able to get to see him. And not all of his exorcisms were successful.
That was a good question.
Thank you.
It didn't turn the thing on a dime.
Yeah, I think that was implied.
So what are you going to do now?
So now, you guys want to give Billy Friedkin a round of applause?
Oh, yeah. Well, that's what they're going to do.